All right, this is fantastic. At this point, you should be set up with Visual Studio Code, Node.js, and Git. And I'm going to be working out of a folder called Hardhat Free Code Camp. At this point, you should have node --version git --version. And if you're using Windows, this should say WSL or Ubuntu or something like that. And if you have all that, that means we're ready to go. Now, a quick note, something that you'll see me do a lot, and you can do this as well. Oftentimes, when my terminal gets really, really big, or there's a ton of commands in here, it gets a little bit overwhelming for me. So one thing that you can do is you can type clear and hit enter to clear it. Or what you can do is you can hit Command K if you're on a Mac, or Control K if you're on a Linux or a Windows. And it's one of my favorite keyboard shortcuts that I use all the time. Additionally, the trash can and the X here are very different. If I go do a couple of enters here and we're down here, if I hit the trash can and then pull my terminal back up by doing the toggle or by doing terminal new terminal, you'll see all those lines are still here. But if I hit the trash can and then pull the terminal back up, you'll see it actually refreshes. Mine has a special command that prints stuff out. Trashing your terminal is basically deleting whatever's running in it, and the X is just hiding it. And it's hitting Control tilde or toggling our terminal or whatever command it is on your environment, that's equivalent to hitting the hide, not the trash. So if we want to remove and start a terminal over, we hit the trash can and then we pull it back up. All right, so now we're going to start working with ethers and we're going to start learning to code our transactions and our contract deployments and everything programmatically at a relatively low level. And we're going to learn how to deploy and interact with our contracts using the Ethers.js package. Now, to get started, I'm going to recommend you create a folder where you're going to put all of your projects in it. I'm going to create a new directory called HH-FCC, which stands for Hardhat Free Code Camp. And once we run that command, we can cd into HH-FCC, and this is where we'll create all of our projects for this course moving forward, so that we have them all in one place. Now, to get started, whenever you create a new project, you always want to create a new folder. So to create a new folder, we're going to do mkdir, and we're going to call this Ethers Simple Storage, like that. And now, if you type ls, you'll see that there is one folder named Ethers Simple Storage. ls is how you list all the contents of your folder. You might have a lot of other folders in here. I only have the one since I created this new folder for this. Now, what you can do, you can type code, ethers simple, and then if you hit tab, it should autocomplete for you. And if you hit enter, Visual Studio Code should open up a new Visual Studio Code for you that is inside of Ethers Simple Storage. If you open up your terminal now, your home directory for this workspace is going to be Ethers Simple Storage, as this is what pops up. If that doesn't work for you, what we can also do is you can hit File, Open Folder, and then open the folder that you just created or that you want to open. This again will open up VS Code, and if we open up our terminal, we see we're inside of Ethers Simple Storage. This is so powerful because as we create files, we'll be able to see those files in our Explorer here. This button here stands for the Explorer. If we click it, we can see the different files in here. And I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this file.txt because we're not actually going to use that. Now, it's this part of the course where we're actually going to start jumping into some JavaScript. Since this course isn't a JavaScript course, if you're unfamiliar with JavaScript, it might be a little bit tricky. If you want to come into this with a better understanding of JavaScript and Node.js, there is a Free Code Camp YouTube video teaching Node.js for beginners, and a link to this will be in the GitHub repo associated with this course. There's also a JavaScript Free Code Camp video that I'm also going to put in the description for this course. Keep in mind that JavaScript and Node.js are slightly different, and we are going to go over some of the differences as we code along here. But for the most part, learning one means you've learned the majority of the other. So if you want to pause and go through these videos before continuing here, please feel free to do so. You don't have to. You can absolutely continue on with the course as is. And if you get confused or stuck on some JavaScript piece, feel free to pause, Google it, and come back. But just to reiterate, you can check out the JavaScript programming full course and also the Node.js full course, as those are both going to help you. like I was saying before, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime. So it's not exactly JavaScript, but we're going to write our code in JavaScript. And if that's confusing, just don't worry about it right now. And as we go through this course, I'll show you where the differences are. But basically, you can think of Node.js and JavaScript kind of being the same thing. The big thing about Node.js is it allows us to write JavaScript code in the back end, as opposed to running JavaScript on the front end. JavaScript is made to be a browser run language, like running inside of, Chrome, Brave, Firefox, etc. Node.js allows it to become a scripting language, a backend language, which is why the syntax between the front end JavaScript and the back end JavaScript, or the Node.js JavaScript, are going to be a little bit different. Additionally, as we go along in this code, if you're familiar with TypeScript, all of our code is going to come with a TypeScript edition. TypeScript is what's known as a statically typed version of JavaScript. And it'll be this one. It'll be TypeScript, not TypeScript edition. I'll go ahead and fix that and remove this one to make it clear. TypeScript is a type-safe version of JavaScript, which, if that's confusing, don't worry too much about that. But we are going to do all of our programming in JavaScript. And then if the code is different enough, I'll show you how to do it in TypeScript as well. However, for most of them, we're not going to show you the TypeScript editions because it's going to be really similar. But you can always refer back to the GitHub repository to see all the code for the TypeScript. Now, if you're new to this space, I actually do recommend you go ahead and start with JavaScript and learn how to do TypeScript later on. TypeScript actually catches bugs early on, making it a lot easier to code your projects in the long run. However, it does take a lot of extra typing, and it can be a little bit frustrating learning how types work for beginners. JavaScript is a little bit more loose as a language and lets us to kind of do whatever we want, but it can cause for headache later on. So if you do run into some issues and you do run into some bugs, it might be a good idea to try TypeScript on for size and see how that fares. Well, let's go ahead and begin working on our local development environment and getting set up to do everything in Ethers.js and in JavaScript. Whoops, and I actually went and renamed this folder to Ethers Simple Storage -FCC. The reason I added this -FCC is all the GitHub repositories associated with this course, all the GitHub repos have this -FCC to know that it is part of this hard hat JavaScript course. Awesome, let's jump in and let's start working with Solidity and our smart contracts locally in Visual Studio Code. As you can probably tell by the name of this folder, and of course, if you looked at the code, this project is going to be our simple storage project, but developed locally using Ethers. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get in that smart contract code. So what we can do is make sure we have the Explorer selected. We can go ahead and right click and select New File and do simple storage.sol. Just close this for now. Is we can copy paste our simple storage code from our last section into VS Code. If you closed Remix or you forgot where it is, you can just go to the Ethers Simple Storage FCC repo, hit simplestorage.sol, and we can just copy all the code in here. And then come back over, select simplestorage.sol, and paste it in. Now, an important note about Visual Studio Code is that when you see this little white dot up here, it means that this file isn't saved. To save, you can hit File, Save, and it'll go away like that. Or what you can do is you can hit Command S or Control S, depending on if you're on a Windows, a Mac, or a Linux. Now you'll see here that this code is a little bit hard to read, this simplestorage.sol. It doesn't have the syntax highlighting that we saw in Remix. So we want to go ahead and add a Visual Studio Code extension to give this syntax highlighting. So what we can do is come over to this bar over here. Looks like this. And if you don't see it on the left-hand bar, you should click these three dots and it should be in here. But we'll go ahead and click extensions. And what we're going to do is we're going to look up Solidity plus Hardhat. And we're going to install this Solidity plus Hardhat extension for VS Code. Now that we have this installed, if we go back over to our simplestorage.sol, you'll see that all the highlighting is back in. And now it's much easier to read. All right, so this is good. We have our code in here. We have our syntax highlighting. Now let's add an auto formatter or a default formatter. Right now our code is pretty good with the way that it's formatted, but what if we accidentally do some stuff like this or maybe even like this. We add a ton of new lines, etc. Our code can start to look pretty gross. And even though the code itself is fine and it'll run the exact same way with all this extra white space, it doesn't look very good, right? And due to that, it can be a little bit hard to read. What we want to do then, we want to open up our settings and adjust our VS Code so that it auto formats whenever we save. So whenever we save, so that whenever it goes from the little white dot here to no white dot, this whole thing gets automatically formatted to something that looks really nice. Okay. So what we can do is we can open up our command palette. To open up our command palette, you can hit View, Command Palette, and it'll get a little pop-up that looks like this. Another way to open up your command palette is you can hit Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P, depending on if you're on a Mac or a Linux or Windows. And what we want to do is we want to type in settings, and we're going to open settings JSON. We don't want to open the default settings JSON. We don't want to touch these, but we want to open our JSON settings. You'll also notice there are user settings and workspace settings. These are pieces that we can adjust as well, but we're going to just go right into the JSON settings. So I already have some stuff in here, but yours might be blank, or you might have some stuff in here as well. So what we're going to do is if you have stuff in here already, we're going to add a comma, then we're going to do quotes, solidity, close the brackets. We're gonna do a little colon and something like this. This means that we're gonna apply some settings to our Visual Studio Code whenever we're working with Solidity. One of the things that we're gonna add in here is gonna be an editor.default formatter. And you might even get a pop-up that tells you some different things that we can use for a default formatter. Our default formatter is gonna be Nomic Foundation.hardhat-solidity. This will mean that anytime we go to format our code, it'll use the Hardhat Solidity plugin as its default formatter. The Hardhat Solidity plugin comes with some formatting and a lot of other really useful tools for us writing our code. So now that we have this part in, the next thing we're going to do is add format on save if we haven't already. We could add it in here in our JSON, but I'm going to add it not in the JSON file. I'm going to add it in the overall file. So if we open that command palette back up, and we type in settings, open user settings, this is another really good place where we can look and add settings with a UI. So these two do essentially the same thing. It's just that this one has styles and a little bit more context versus settings.json just says, okay, give me the raw code for it. This tells us a little bit more. So you can use either one. But we're going to look for format on save. And you're going to want this checked if you haven't already. This means that every time we save, VS Code is going to try to format our code for us. So now that we have this checked, we have settings.json added in. And remember, we want to save this. Remember, if you see this white dot, that means it's not saved. So you're going to want to save it. And we close it out. And we close this out too. If we come back in here and we add a bunch of random new spaces or whatever you want to make it look a little bit ugly, and then we save it, it should automatically reformat to look much nicer, right? So if we do something like this, we hit save, it reformats it to look much nicer. This will make it more readable for you and more readable for anybody else who looks at your code, and it's just really nice. And this line of code for your settings.json is located in the full blockchain solidity course.js. So you could also just copy paste it. We are going to end up overriding that default formatter with another formatter called Prettier pretty soon. But it's great to have a default formatter so that if you don't feel like adding the Prettier code sometime in the future, you can just rely on your default formatter. Awesome. While we're doing formatting, let's also add a default formatter for our JavaScript code. And just to test it out, let's go ahead and create our new file. We'll call it deploy.js. And in here, we can do something like function hi, console.log, hi, and then just add, and then just make it look kind of gross. Maybe something like this. If you hit save and it does some auto formatting, that's great. You can actually turn that off by going back to your command palette and saying save without formatting, and that way it'll be saved and not formatted. The way we can add some auto formatting here is we're going to install another extension. This one is going to be called Prettier. So we can just look up Prettier in the extensions here. And you'll want to install this Prettier Code Formatter. So we're going to go ahead and install this. And great, now it's installed. Prettier is a code formatter that works for many languages like Python, JavaScript, and even Solidity. And pretty soon, we're going to use Prettier for both JavaScript and Solidity. But for now, we're just going to use Prettier for JavaScript. We can enable this by opening back up our command palette. We'll go to Preferences, Open Settings. And the same way we added a Solidity section, we're going to add a JavaScript section. So we're going to add a comma here, some quotes, brackets. We're going to type in JavaScript, close that, colon brackets, and we're going to do the same thing. Editor.default formatter. And then we're going to do, and then in here, we're going to do esvenp.prettier-vs code. And this will make Prettier the default editor for JavaScript. Now, like I said, pretty soon, we're going to have Prettier override both of these for Solidity and JavaScript. And we're going to give Prettier some parameters so that no matter who uses your code, they will always have the exact same formatting. But now that we have Prettier in here as the default editor, if we come back to deploy.js and we hit save, it should format to look a little something like this now. And we go ahead and we do something like this. If we go ahead and do something like this, it'll reformat to look like that. And then additionally, if you want to go back to your command palette, open user settings, not in JSON mode, and we go to default formatter, you can actually even select the default formatter for all languages. If you want to use Prettier for all formatters, feel free to go ahead. But all right, great. Got our JavaScript formatter in as well. Let's start writing some JavaScript code.